Hello guys. So this video is going to be the beginning of a set of videos that are going to explain the rules of exponents. There are about 7 to 8 rules of exponents that are going to come in handy when you're going to try to simplify algebraic expressions. Okay, so the first rule is going to be the multiplication rule of exponents. So all of these rules that I'm going to talk about in this video and the next videos, these rules apply to exponents only, which are those small numbers at the top superscript into each of the variables, right? So these rules only apply to the exponents, okay? If you have two regular numbers, coefficients, big numbers on the operations, it's a multiplication, then you have to multiply those numbers normally, right? 2 times 4. Or if you have a division, then you have to divide those two numbers, 20 and 5, normally, right? So these are the rules of exponents. So how are we going to deal with exponents in this case? Okay, so a multiplication rule of exponents, it says that when you are multiplying variables, and I'm just going to come up with a generic example, right? X to the power of 2 times x to the power of 3. So when you are multiplying variables, this is a multiplication of variables of x times x. The result is always going to keep the base. So the result is always going to have an x in here. And the multiplication rule of exponents, this says that when you multiply in variables, you have to add those two exponents. So that's a 2 plus 3 and the result of the exponents. So when you multiply variables, you have to add exponents. And then of course that's x to the power of 2 plus 3, which is 5. Okay, so you add those exponents, the base remains the same. Okay, the base remains the same. So let's take a look at this example. The most common mistake is that because that's a multiplication, people will do this, right? Because they multiply 2 times 5. This is going to be wrong. That's not the correct answer. The rule of multiplication says I keep the base. They're both x's, so I'm going to keep the x. And then I have to add the exponents. So when you multiply two variables, you add the exponents. The result, that's x to the power of 2 plus 5, which is x to the power of 7. Okay, and this rule applies also for negative exponents or positive exponents or fractional exponents. It's the same rule, okay? So in this case, I have an x to the power of negative 2 times an x to the power of 3, and the rule of multiplication says I have to add those exponents. So negative 2 plus 3. I'm adding the negative 2 and I'm adding the 3, okay? And then if you do this mathematical operation of negative 2 plus 3, that's going to be x to the power of 1, which is the same as just x. Okay, so the rules apply the same. The rules apply the same. So for this next example, that's a multiplication of variables. I'm multiplying m times n. They all have their exponents, right? And the rule says I have to add those exponents of 5 plus negative 3. And then if you can see my video about adding real numbers. I have some examples in there to add a positive and a negative number. So the rule of signs says that if I have two different signs together, that means that's going to become negative. And then you just do the mathematical operation, 5 minus 3, that's 2. Okay, we are not subtracting because of the rule. Okay, we are adding because of the rule. That's an addition. This negative 3 over here, this happens to be a negative 3, right? So we're taking 5 plus negative 3. So this is what we're doing. 5 plus negative 3. And of course, after the rules of signs, the signs over here, those two signs are going to become a negative sign, and then you can do the mathematical operation. Okay, normally. So the last example, this is a slightly different because I have coefficients, the big numbers. So those big numbers, they have to be multiplied normally. Okay, so first thing that I'm going to do is multiply 2 times 4, and then I'm going to multiply the x's. Okay, so numbers, the big numbers first, and then the letters. So this is going to result into 2 times 4. This is a normal multiplication of big numbers, so you have to do the multiplication. 2 times 4. This multiplication over here is going to yield an 8. Right? We're not adding those two numbers because this is not an addition, right? The multiplication rule of exponents says I have to add exponents if I'm multiplying variables, like in this next case, right? Where I'm multiplying x to the power of 8 times x to the power of 2. Then in this case, I will have to keep the base, which is x, and then add those two exponents, so 8 plus 2. And the final result is going to be 8x to the power of 10 in this case. Okay. So this is for multiplication of exponents when you're multiplication rule of exponents. So when you're multiplying variables, the big letters, you have to add the exponents. And the opposite rule instead of multiplication rule, it's going to be the quotient rule or the division rule. Okay, the division rule of exponents, I'm going to come up with another generic example. It says that when you are dividing variables, this is the opposite of multiplication, right? When you are dividing variables, and I'm just going to put x to the power of 6 divided by x to the power of 2. Okay. When you are dividing variables, you also have to keep the base, which is x, and then you're going to subtract the exponents. Top minus bottom, always. So the top is 6, and the bottom is 2. So 6 minus 2. This is for division when you are dividing variables. Okay, and of course 6 minus 2, that's going to be 4. So the result is x to the power of 4. Okay. For the next example, let's see we can do this. So that's a division of x to the power of 8 divided by x to the power of 2. So I have to keep the base, which is x, and then the exponent, since this is a division, I'm going to subtract. So 8 minus 2. And the result over here is going to be x to the power of 6. Common mistake, people divide those two numbers. People do the division of those two numbers, that's going to be wrong. Okay, the rule of exponents says that when I am dividing variables, I have to subtract the exponents. Okay, top minus bottom always. This next example, this is very common to get it wrong when you have a negative exponent at the bottom. You just have to follow the same rules, right? The rule says I'm going to take the top one, 7, and I'm going to subtract the bottom one. So 7 minus, and what is the exponent in the bottom? The exponent in the bottom is a negative 3. So 7 minus whatever's in the bottom. So can you see why people might mess up the signs in here? Okay, so let's go ahead and deal with those two signs. I have two negative signs that are together. So when you multiply to negative, negative times a negative, that's going to become a positive sign. Okay, so in reality, this becomes 7 plus 3, and the result is x to the power of 10. So top minus bottom, top is 7 minus the bottom is negative 3. So 7 minus negative 3, these two signs over here become a positive sign. So 7 plus 3 is 10. Okay, we are not adding because of the rule. We are doing a subtraction. But since I have another negative sign in the bottom, that's why those two negative signs cancel out. Okay. The next and last example on this video is going to be 20r to the power of 10 divided by 5r to the power of 5. Okay, the same thing as in the multiplication. If I have big numbers, they behave normally. Okay, so that the first thing I have to do is the division of 20 over 5. Those big numbers, you're not going to subtract those because those are not exponents. Okay, subtraction happens when you have a division of variables that have an exponent. Okay, so in this case, it's going to be 20 over 5. And then r, I'm going to keep the base, and I have to take those two exponents and subtract them, top minus bottom. So that's going to be 10 minus 5. Okay. And then the big numbers, 20 and 5, you can divide them. So 20 divided by 5, that should be 4, normal division. Okay. And the r is going to keep the exponent of the result of the subtraction, right? Which is 10 minus 5. The result is 5. Common mistake, okay? They divide 10 and 5, and the result has an r square. That's going to be wrong, okay? The rules of exponents says if I have two exponents on the same variable, I have to do a subtraction, top minus bottom always. So this should be my final result for r to the power of 5. On the following videos, I'm going to explain a little bit more in depth some of the other rules of exponents.